The discovery of gold at Lyndhurst and tin in numerous places in the northeast had a major impact on Bridport. In 1883, the township of Bridport was declared and a post and telegraph office established. This photograph of Bridport, taken about 1900, shows some of the effects of these discoveries. The Forester Inn, owned by Captain Jones, stands next to his house. It was in Captain Jones's Forester Inn that in 1876 an inquest was held about the death of Trooper Martin Rourke, who drowned crossing the Great Forester River. It appears that Rourke may have attempted to cross the river at night and had not used the usual fording place opposite the police station. Constable Patrick Harrington of Bridport found Rourke's horse outside the station fence and that it had crossed the river without Rourke. As large sharks had been seen in the area, one was shot and inspected but only contained mullet. The body was discovered 5 days later on West Beach. Rourke left a wife and 8 children. In 2023, these people are crossing where the old ford was in 1876. This building later became the post office in 1883. A copy of a telegram found in the roof of the old post office shows how this new technology was put to good use. Apparently the beer for the Branksome Hotel had gone missing. The sheds and small wharf belonged to Captain A.B. Smythe and were used to store tin and other goods being shipped out of Bridport. Although by 1900 the benefits for Bridport had gone, these buildings came from the boom times of the 1870s and 1880s. The initial jetty was near the present bridge. When tin was discovered in 1875, larger port facilities were needed, and a new jetty and storage sheds were built near the river mouth at Smythe's Corner, known then as Crask's Jetty, after the manager of the facility. The Dorset Steam Navigation Company was established by the Dinham family, and larger vessels traded between Bridport and Launceston. The SS Dorset was one of the regular users of the port. Built with twin screws and shallow draft, she could usually safely negotiate the shallow estuary studded with huge granite boulders. But accidents did happen. On one occasion she hit some of the numerous rocks in the channel and strained her timbers, and had to be jacked up off the rocks after the cargo had been unloaded. Another view of Crask Jetty and the Dorset Steam Navigation storage sheds at Smythe's Corner that were no longer in regular use. Note how the river channel runs closer to the corner than present day. Possible people in this photo include old Dad Pettit, who bought the Coronella from Captain Smythe, Alex Copleston and boat builder Mr. Lockwood from Georgetown. This early 1900 photograph shows clearly the difficulty early mariners had in negotiating the many rocks in the channel. In the background you can see Crask Jetty, the tin sheds, and in the far distance just make out the tiny settlement of Bridport. The only building north of the jetty is the police station, which you can just see through the trees at the far right. Taken from the same place, this photograph shows you just how much the river has been altered. The rocks that just show above the ground in the far right used to be in the channel. After building higher rock walls on the side of the river, the Dangerfield dredged the river and backfilled behind the retaining wall, creating the present skateboard park and straightening the channel.
The year 1889 becomes very significant for Bridport. It is the year that the railway officially arrived in Scottsdale. So that's the line from Launceston to Scottsdale. Now, it had been planned and known about for many years, since the early 1880s. It pretty much signalled the end of the first stage of Bridport's development, because all of a sudden, to get your supplies from Launceston, you no longer had to go via Bridport. You could just get them put on the train and delivered straight from Launceston to Scottsdale and then delivered out from there. Similarly, the produce that you produced didn't have to go via Bridport and put on a boat. It could go to Scottsdale, put on a train and straight into Launceston. A very, very significant change to Bridport. So if we look now at some newspaper stories of Bridport in the 1890s, it's the decade in which the little town pretty much went into the doldrums a bit. So someone said, from Scottsdale, a drive of 13 miles takes the traveller to Bridport, a once thriving little town, now almost deserted, owing to the railway diverting the traffic. People at the time weren't always complimentary of Bridport. Someone said, nearer Bridport there is much useless sandy land, worthless even for grass. At Bridport there is said to be some fine fishing grounds, both in the salt water and in the local rivers. And then in 1894, Mr. Bald reported that culverts on the road to Bridport were in a dangerous condition. And in view of the traffic that was on the road during the holidays and Christmas week, Bridport being the holiday resort of the people, it would be desirable to spend £5 in repairs. So what we're learning there is that Bridport as a trading area had significantly declined, but for the people of Scots New Country, it was still the place to go for holidays. This next slide is of the road as it once was from Bridport to Scottsdale. And I think the thing to look at here is just how sandy the soil was. Probably a dry period, but there are no logs across the road, which was a problem with trees falling over time. One of the problems at the time was the simple heavy machinery that used the roads. People used to drag mining machinery down roads, to drag timber down roads. So it didn't take long for a newly made road or a newly improved road to deteriorate again. So to be honest, this view of the Bridport Road doesn't look too bad at all, but you can only imagine that with a little bit of rain, it could turn to mush very quickly. Here is another view of the Bridport to Scottsdale Road. This one is labelled the Ivanhoe Road. I suspect it's a bit later than the previous one, but the road in this particular part of the road looks much better. Really a hardened material.
With the loss of shipping to the railway, Bridport had fallen on hard times between 1890 and 1910. Bowood had become neglect, and it was sad to see what remained of those orchards that had produced so much fruit in the early days. Even the gardens were run down. These images from the Weekly Courier of 1902 show Bridport as a holiday destination rather than a place of commerce. Holiday makers were common, but the port was empty. Mr. Smythe's Torrington House was one of 3 accommodation places, the other being Ivanhoe House and Brimelor House. There were still shipments of wool from the district, but the population of Bridport had declined, and the police station had become a private residence. Still, Bridport was becoming popular as a favourite summer resort for fishing, shooting, boating and bathing in both fresh and salt water. This photograph was labelled as a ford across the Brid River between Auntie Bell's Brimelor House and the Bowood turnoff. It was taken about the turn of the century. Some interesting and thought-provoking images of Bridport in 1912. The top panorama shows the foreshore vista basically untouched. The lower left is taken down the Little Forester River. Again, not a lot of change. However, the photo of Granite Point, bottom right, I believe is taken from above Mermaid's Pool. You can clearly see the rock that is the Bridport Challenge, and it is largely clear of vegetation. 2 of Bridport's well-known identities, Dada Nelson and his wife Florrie. Mr. Nelson was a retired lighthouse keeper who ran a tourist venture up the Forester River to a small picnic area near the present Barnburgle Dunes clubhouse. On one trip, Dada Nelson was knocked overboard by an overhanging branch. No one left on board knew how to steer, and the boat became stuck on the mud bank for hours. 1911 was a momentous year for Bridport. The year saw the North East residents voting to establish a railway from Scottsdale to Bridport. Although it had strong support, nothing eventuated. However, the Tasmanian Timber Company built a jetty at what is now known as Croquet-Lawn Beach and started a light railway to a mill at Forrester. The Forrester Timber Mill was one of the most up-to-date sawmilling plants in Tasmania in 1919. It had twin breaking down saws and 30 employees with a weekly pay sheet of over £250. Did you notice a dog with a hat on? In 1921, a large log hauler had been installed and operated by 5 men. Sawn timber was transported on steel rails to the Bridport jetty 22 miles away. The 2 locomotives, the Eddie and the Abe, pulled the wagons. At Bridport, the Rara and the 3 Cheers shipped the timber to Victorian markets. This has given Bridport a major boost to the sleepy village by the sea. Here the timber company's train approaches the bridge over the Brid River, past the old Forrester Inn, which was later the first Bridport post office. Notice the plumes of smoke and sparks coming from the train, and there lies a story. This locomotive was purchased from a sugarcane factory in Queensland, and it initially had a spark arrestor funnel. Barney Miller, the engine driver, said it looked stupid and had it removed. In summer, the train frequently caused fires, so Barney would blow the whistle on approaching Bridport, and children would ride on the train and help put out the fires along the foreshore. How I got this photograph is also interesting. Roger McLennan and I were out at the Forrester walking along the old railway line when I received a phone call from a man in Queensland asking if I was Jeff Jennings of Bridport, and that he had a photo of a locomotive that according to his records was sold to a timber company in Bridport. Did I know about it? He was amazed when I told him that at that moment I was actually walking on the very track that this locomotive operated on in the 1920s. The Tas Timber Company's narrow gauge tramway crossed the main road near the old Forrester Inn building. It then crossed the Brid River on a separate bridge. It then ran alongside the road towards Smythe's Bayview House, where it crossed the road again and then followed along the foreshore. In 1916, the North East Harbour Trust built the Granite Point jetty, which could handle larger vessels. The Tasmanian Timber Company agreed to use the new jetty to help in running costs. The old Croquet-Lawn jetty was dismantled and found to have been weakened by marine teredo worms. The new jetty at Granite Point was built of New South Wales turpentine logs to resist the worm, and they are still standing over 100 years later. The new Granite Point jetty gave a boost to Bridport trading, with more diverse cargoes being shipped to and from the port. Here we see the SS Tambar unloading at the Granite Point jetty. At the top, the Barnett boys loading timber on the Rara for shipment to Melbourne. Looking back along the pier, we can see how few houses there were along Bentley and Westwood Streets in 1920. An interesting yet mysterious photograph taken at the end of the Granite Point jetty in the 1920s. Details unknown, but they look a bit like the Bridport Mafia. The Barnetts initially took up farming in Cuckoo. It was 1912 that the Barnett family arrived in Bridport. Charles and Asundo Barnett soon became important members of the Bridport community. He built many new houses in Bridport and started the fishing industry. Charlie worked at the new Forrester Timber Mill, as well as being harbour master for the North East Harbour Trust. In the 1920s, the Barnetts built a guest house, which still stands today. The Bridport family made and are still making a valuable contribution to the prosperity of Bridport. In the early days, Bridport people had their house cow to supply fresh milk. These were grazed on common ground. The Barnett boys were a lively bunch, and decided to have a bit of fun. One night they used whitewash to disguise the cows, and next morning Mrs. Smythe complained she couldn't find her cow. This is Asunto Barnett with Daisy the cow. In March 1915, the timber company ran a special train to Bridport for the Forester settlement residents. Sports were held on the beach opposite the Brid River. A picnic was held on the beach next to the jetty at what is now Croaky Lawn Beach. In January 1917, Mr. Charles Barnett warned bathers that a big shark had been seen lurking off the new jetty. Early attempts to catch it failed when it straightened out a large iron hook. The Barnett boys eventually managed to capture the shark using an even larger hook and 3 shots from a rifle to quieten things down. The shark measured 9 feet long. The official opening of the new Bridport Hall in March 1915 gave politicians, state and local, chance to espouse on the future of Bridport as an interstate shipping harbour. Others complained that visiting politicians failed to appreciate the agricultural potential of land around Bridport. The Suter family arrived in Bridport in 1924 and soon added much to the town. A shop next to Barnett's guest house and, importantly, a bus and mail service. They built Bridport's first petrol browser and erected the shop that is now the news agency. They were strong members of the Bridport Progress Association, building bathing sheds and a kiosk near Eastman's Beach. The new deviation on the Sidling Road in 1926 led to a resurgence in tourism, particularly in Bridport. Travel by car from Launceston was now much safer. Progress associations were started to put the Scottsdale district on the tourist map. The car allowed a faster and more enjoyable form of transport, and though Bridport Road was still a sandy track, it was passable by car. Holiday accommodation in Bridport continued to expand, and holiday cottages were built along Bentley and Westwood streets. The permanent population of Bridport was 95 in 1921, and by 1933 it only reached 135. But there were over 1,000 people in the campground during the summer of 1935. Auntie Bell, or Mrs. Isabel Hazelwood, conducted Brimelow House for accommodation of tourists, visitors and guests. Auntie Bell's bright personality and happy humour made her a host of friends. She gave help to those in need, particularly the young and old. It was said that a serviceman writing to her during the war simply wrote Auntie Bell Bridport on the envelope, because anyone from Alice Springs southwards knew who she was. In 1954, after she had passed away, residents of Bridport built a memorial to her. A brass plaque still remains in the main street where it stood. In 1926, a major project for Bridport was conducted by the Scottsdale Progress and Tourism Association, building the Bridport Promenade or foreshore track. This project was organised under military lines. 6 divisions of workers arrived in a fleet of 40 cars from Scottsdale with a total of 180 men and boys. Local ladies provided refreshments, and by 5:30 in the afternoon, over a mile of track had been formed. The General Officer commanding was Mr. A.G. Galloway. Schooling in Bridport appears to have started in 1914, when Mr. Robert Coppelson received signatures from parents guaranteeing attendance of 19 students. Miss Somerville was a provisional teacher. Classes were moved to the hall in 1915, but this proved to be too cold, and they moved to the Methodist Church. In 1934, a new school was built on the present site, with parents clearing the site of scrub. In the late 1920s, there was regular shipping to the port. The Barnacks extended the guest house, and a footbridge to East Beach was built, but soon dismantled. The post office under Mr. and Mrs. Bonner was moved to the site of the present top IGA shop. Fishing boats still had difficulties in the river, and the Mattingleys started a lifesaving group at Mattingleys Beach. In the 1930s, small fishing boats were being built in the estuary of Trent Water. Cooter and crayfish were being caught. This photograph was taken opposite the police station. The Adams family moved from Pipers River to Lease Umtali. E.B. Adams drained Jerusalem Plains to the west of Bridport before taking over Barnbougle. After a few previous attempts, and the advice of a government surveyor saying there wasn't enough fall, the Adams completed a number of cuts to divert the Forester River into Anderson Bay in 1923. This was an amazing task using only basic equipment, a scoop, shovels and bullocks. Despite this, the Adams partnership failed and they sold the property. This silent 1930s movie film of Bridport, taken by Mr. White, turns back the clock on Bridport. It shows the remains of the old Crask's jetty in the river, scenes at Eastman's, Croaky Lawn and Adams Beaches, Dinham's Shalimar House and camping scenes on the foreshore.
Sunny day without you, clouds in the sky. With you my luck will stay, without you fortune will fly. With you I'll never stop until I've reached the top. Without you I will never get by. With you a happy song, without you castles that fall. With you I can't go wrong, without you chances are small. With you my feathers unfurl, right there on top of the world. Without you I'd just nothing at all.
1925 saw the closing of the Forester Timber Mill, and in 1938 the Granite Point jetty was burnt after a number of fires were reported on the structure. Attempts were made to put them out, but they failed. Bridport was increasingly a popular campsite, and a croaky lawn had been built. Note the lack of any substantial fishing structures at the Brid River.